So this is the pattern for the racerback tank top. This is the front, and then this is the back, and you can see it's got a very shallow center back area here. And then I have a pattern piece for the armhole binding, which is going to go right around the armholes, and then also the neckband binding. So we need to get these cut out. Now on the pattern pieces, the front and, this is the back, I'm sorry, the back and the front, these are cut on the fold, so we're going to need to fold the fabric over. And when you fold your fabric over, only fold the amount of the width of the pattern piece that you need. The bindings do not need to be cut on the fold, they actually just need to be cut on the flat of the fabric. It doesn't need to be folded over, unless you can fold over your fabric in half to cut 2 of the armhole binding. We need 2 of the armhole binding and just 1 of the neck binding. And although my pattern pieces say they're all cut out of the self fabric, I'm actually going to cut the armband and the neckband out of a contrasting color. So I'm going to be using a striped fabric, but in this exercise I'm not going to worry about matching the stripes on the side seam. So the stripe will be the front and the back, and then the binding is going to be out of a solid black. Okay, and these are both jersey knits. So also seam allowances are 1/4 inch, except at the hem is 1 inch. So I'm going to go ahead and lay this out. I'm going to speed up the cutting process so that the video doesn't take so long. So once I get done with that, I'll be right back to where you begin to sew the garment together. Alright, so now that we've got all the pattern pieces cut together, we're going to actually start assembling this tank top. So I don't need the neckband, the bindings right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually, let's lay out the back pattern piece, the back garment piece actually. It's not a pattern piece anymore, it's a cut piece of fabric. So this is the back all laid out. And what we need to do is we need to match the front face side or the right side to the back at the shoulder. And what we're going to do is we're just going to choose one of the shoulder seams to sew together, just one of them. So if this is the back and if you are wearing it, think about wearing this shirt and which side you would rather have a larger seam on, because when we sew one of these together, we're going to leave it open and then we're going to put the neck binding on. So it will be kind of like a visible little seam. Not that bad, but you know, it will be an extra little bump there. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to sew, let's see, the left side. Let's do the right side. So I'm going to match this shoulder. Let's just match everything up. Okay, so lay everything out nicely, nice and flat. I'm going to choose the right shoulder. I'm going to match that seam up. And I'll go ahead and pin it together. And then I will go over and I will serge this closed, just this seam. And then we'll be right back here to prepare for the neckband binding. Okay, so now I have the shoulder seam sewn and I've got my neckband here ready to go. I'm gonna set that down here really quick. So I'm gonna pull this open so you can see what that neckline looks like. Okay, so this is our neckline, this is the back, this is the front, and we're going to add the binding right around this neckline. All right, so one of the things that I don't have on the pattern is I don't have a center back at the neck and a center front notch at the neckline. So I'm just going to kind of fold this over in half just really quickly, and I'm just going to clip a very tiny clip. That's my back, and I'm going to fold this over at the front really quick to get an approximate center front, just a very easy clip. So we need those because on the neckband I have notches. So the castle notch is for the center back, and then the next pimple notch next to it goes to the shoulder seam. The next pimple notch after that, which is further down the road, is actually the center front, which is here, and then of course we finish it out. Now to get this started, we need to fold the neckband in half lengthwise, matching those notches. You're going to fold it to the wrong sides together so we see the face side. So if you're not sure, sometimes you can look at it at the side, and if what you're looking for is a nice straight lines or one of the shiny sides. So the straight lines are usually the face side of the fabric. So I'm actually just going to pin here at each of the notches. Now you could, if you wanted to, overlock this all the way down, but then you would lose your notches. So you would need to mark where all of those notches are if you do that. You could also straight stitch it and then pull the straight stitches out. If you feel more comfortable, you need to keep everything together as you sew. I'm just going to do this freehand and see how we do. I don't generally like to press this before I'm done, because sometimes when you press and then maybe that's not actually going to be the actual fold mark, that line is actually pressed in. So I'm just going to keep this pinned together in a few spots. So this neckband, I should say, is actually is a pretty lightweight jersey knit, and the garment itself is actually has good body to it. You can see that it doesn't, just flop over. So it may not have been the best choices of fabrics to match together, but it's what I had on hand, and I'm having a hard time ordering fabrics at the moment. Okay, so I've got that pinned together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to match all of my notches first. So I'm going to match here at the center back. And remember, these notches extend beyond the seam edge line, so we'll need to put these at past the edge. And I'm just going to pin that using the same pin. And then I've got my shoulder notch here, which I'm going to pin at the shoulder. And I'm going to have this seam fold toward the back. You don't need to try to stretch it yet, just match it to those spots. And it will, see, there's a difference there. That's because we're going to stretch this neck binding in to get it to fit the neckline. And then we're going to come around and we're going to match this notch to the center front. And then we don't have another notch, we have the finished edge, so we're going to match this up to the finished. I'll just do that for right now. So I actually didn't start off with on the back side. I need to actually match this edge too. So I'll just match that. Okay, and when we're at the sewing machine, the serger, I'm actually going to stretch the neckband to get it to fit into that specific area. We don't really want to stretch the garment edge. We want to just stretch the binding. All right, so I will go over to the serger and we'll get this sewn on, and then we'll come right back here. Okay, so we have the binding attached to the lining. Now you could leave it like this if you wanted to. It's no big deal. It would just make your shoulder seams a little bit wider and you'd have a little less armhole area. But what we're going to do is, now that this is the seam, right, we sewed it on like this, what we're going to do, and I've got my pins handy, is what we're going to do is we're going to take this and we're going to fold that right over that seam allowance. And I'm going to go ahead and pin this so you can see it. Normally I don't pin it because I just do it as I go, but I want to fold that directly over and pin it to the seam allowance. And I'm going to do this all the way around this neckline. And I'm not really stretching anything, I'm just folding it so it covers that seam allowance. Now, one of the things about sewing this binding on is that you actually need to do it pretty accurately, that you're not cutting extra off or whatever, because it will cause irregularities in the width of the finished binding. So I'm really kind of pushing this to the edge here. And I'm just going to finish pinning this all the way around. So what I'm doing, if you can see, is I'm just taking my thumbs and I'm kind of pushing this, brushing it away from that seam allowance. And then I'm feeling where the seam allowance is, and I'm pinning it directly to the seam allowance. So now I'm not stretching, again, I'm not stretching this again as I'm doing that. It looks like I'm stretching it, but I'm not. I'm gonna have to stretch it when I sew the top stitching, and we're gonna do a zigzag top stitch right on this. So a zigzag stitch stretches, and we need the neck to stretch when we get in and out of the garment. Also, so it stretches along with the knit. Just a few more pins here. Now, if you don't want to pin, if you just want to brush this away as you go, that's fine. I'm actually not very fond of pins, but I do this so that everybody has a clear understanding of what they need to do. Okay, last pin. Okay, so everything is pinned. Right, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna make sure that we're gonna zigzag here right to the edge so it's actually catching the seam allowance on underneath. And I believe that I have my machine set at 4mm by 4mm. So depending on what your machine, how your machine sets up the zigzag stitch, it's 4mm wide and 4mm long. So you want generally kind of a short zigzag stitch, not a long one. So, and I've left this here, I didn't cut this off because in some machines, especially in home machines, it doesn't like to start right away at this edge because I've got some thicknesses here. So I use this to actually help it through the machine at the beginning to pull it at the back. So that's just a little tip there. And then the rest of it should sew pretty smoothly. All right, so I'm gonna go over to the machine and zigzag this through. When we're done with that, we'll be right back here. Okay, so we have the neckband binding all on. And one thing that I want to point out that maybe I didn't make clear previously was that it's really important when you initially sew this on to the neckband area is to make sure that your sewing is really accurate. You can see where there are some spaces here that are wider than others, and that's one of the that was where I was a little bit less accurate. So if you're really concerned about that, be very careful that you're not also overstretching it. Overstretching the binding can also cause some irregularities in the width of the binding. In any case, we have this on here, so now we need to actually sew the other shoulder together. So I'm just going to match face side to face side the other side of the shoulder right up here at the edge, and I'll go ahead and put a pin here. This will come out once we get over there. So now you have an option here. You could actually take your regular straight stitch machine and stitch across here just to keep it down. Sometimes when you're in the serger, it doesn't like to start at this edge. It will just push it, and then you won't have matching binding areas. So if you straight stitch across it first to match everything, that will hold everything in place. However, I'm just going to trim these up, and then I'm just going to put it into the serger and hope for the best. We'll see how that looks after it comes out, and then we'll be right back here to work on the armhole binding. All right, so now we have our other shoulder seam sewn, and if you look close, I went back and actually corrected this, so I cheated a little bit. So my serger was not set up properly when I sewed the seam, and so the tension was bad, and it didn't look very pretty. So what I did was, instead of ripping everything out, I just took my straight stitch machine and I stitched along the seam again. We don't really need this to stretch a whole lot, so we actually need it more to stretch up and down. So that's fine. So now we're ready to put our arm bands on, and I'm flipping this over to the face side. And we're gonna do this exactly the same way that we did the neck bands. So let's get a good arm hole opening here. So this is the back. So I have a castle notch here. This is the front. I have a pimple notch here, and then I have this seam. And remember, we cut 2 of the arm bands. So what we need to do is we need to find the wrong side, because we're going to we're going to fold this wrong sides together and match the other sides. And last time what I did was I folded all to the notches, their respective notches, and I pinned the notch first. And because these are, pretty reversible, since we're folding and we've got the face side, it doesn't matter. You don't have to worry about matching the right or wrong notches, because we can flip these. So I'll show you what I mean after I get these ends kind of pinned. Get this end pinned, and this last one. Okay, so this one I folded correctly. So this here, I have the castle notch here, which I had matched to the castle notch here on this on the back, and then I have the pimple notch which goes to the shoulder, and then the next pimple notch that goes to the front, and then of course matching your ends. Now if it were like this, what I'm talking about is maybe the castle notch was here and the pimple, that would be incorrect, but because they're kind of mirror images, it doesn't matter which of the armbands you start with. So I'm just going to go ahead and repin this on here. Remember, I'm going to pin this to the notches first. This middle pimple notch to the shoulder seam. And this other pimple notch to the front. And then I'll pin to the ends. Okay. And then again, what you're going to do, put this in the serger, start here, and you're going to stretch the armhole binding to match the size of the armhole, right? I'm not going to do the other side. The other side is exactly the same. So I'm just going to go ahead and put this on, sew this with the serger, and then we'll be right back and I'll remind you how to flip it over to do the zigzag top stitching like we did on the neckband. All right, so now we have both of the armhole bindings on, and of course, like I said, with the neckband, you could leave it like this if you want to, but just for the purpose of finishing all of the binding, I'm going to remind you that what we did with the binding was that we folded that binding right over on top of the seam allowance, and I'm going to pin it to the seam allowance, and I'm going to do that all along, and then we're going to zigzag this down to cover that seam allowance and hold it right to that seam allowance. So I'm going to get this pinned all along so I can get this done really quickly, and then remind you that I'm going to zigzag stitch this just like the neck at 4 millimeter by 4 millimeter. That's the length that is on my machine. So 4 millimeters long, 4 millimeters wide. And of course, you could do a longer zigzag stitch. If you do a longer zigzag stitch, just be aware that you might be stretching that armhole or the neck line. You might be stretching it out. So just be aware of that. And of course, the wider the zigzag, you know, you might actually be pulling some of the binding away from the edge. So just be careful with that. You know, if you're unsure what to do, just go ahead and make a little sample, and then you'll have that for you the next time you do this. All right, so I've got this one pinned. I'm going to go ahead and pin the other one, and we're going to jump right over to the sewing machine. Okay, so now we've got all our bindings done. All we need to do is match our front and backs, face side or right sides together. And I'm going to pin them up at the side seam. And I do have these waistline notches, so we can actually match those notches. And I'm just going to pin on this side. I'm not sure what side I'm going to be sewing. I think it's going to be the other. So I'm going to match my underarm at the binding. And then of course I'll match my hem here. I also have a hem notch. So I'll match it there, and I'll do this on both sides. Now, all we really need to do is overlock this straight down. What I'm going to do, because I had a little issue before with my serger, what I'm going to do is I think I will match these. This is the underarm, but I'm going to use my sewing machine, my straight stitch, and I'm just going to stitch right here where the binding is, and that will actually help me try to keep the binding matched for when I sew it. And also, sometimes the overlock doesn't like to take this in the beginning. So I'm gonna go ahead and sew this with the machine first, and then I'm gonna actually sew the seam with the overlock or the serger machine, okay? All right, so now things are starting to look like a tank top. So we did the side seams, and you have these extra threads. Don't cut these off. So if you're watching this before you get to the serging of the side seams, don't cut this part off here. If you cut it off, it will unravel, and then the rest of your seam at the underarm will come undone. So we're gonna finish this off. We're gonna clean this up at the very end. First, I want to do the hem. So this is inside. I'm going to turn it right side out. And remember that the hem allowance is 1 inch. And I am not a fan of pressing knits. So especially if there's a synthetic in it, you run the risk of actually melting that synthetic, and then you can never get it to go back to what it was originally. So what I like to do is I just kind of like to chalk the line, and then you can pin it up, or you can just eye it as you hem it. I'm actually just going to chalk this, and I have white chalk. You can of course use a different colored chalk. You can also just put pins at the 1 inch fold mark. I'm just going to chalk, and then I'll fold it up and then pin it. And then I'm going to use a zigzag stitch to actually hold it up. So for the zigzag stitch, you could use a longer or wider stitch if you want. I like things to match the same stitching as we did for the binding. So I'm going to keep my zigzag stitch at 4mm by 4mm. That way everything there has it matches, and it just kind of has a nice cohesion for your garment. Okay, so I've actually got my chalking done. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to fold that on that chalk line, and then I'll put a pin. I'll do that all the way around. Now, if you have a cover stitch machine, your cover stitch will actually be done on the face side. So you can put a pin where your overlock is on the top side, and then you can cover stitch this. So I do have a cover stitch machine, but I like to use the zigzag so that people who don't have a cover stitch can see what to do. So I'm actually putting the pin on the inside, and I'm going to zigzag over the overlocked edge. So I'm going to finish pinning this up all the way around, and we will go over to the machine and stitch this down. Okay, so remember these threads that I told you not to clip off, so we're gonna go and take care of them now. I thought I'd just go ahead and do it right here at the machine instead of going over to the table and then coming back to the machine. So the first thing I did was I actually want to know which side is the back side. So what I've done is I've just put little pins just to let myself know what is the back of the tank top. And I'm gonna go and turn this inside out real quick. Okay, so we're inside out, and we have these threads. We don't want to clip them off, because if we do, then they'll start unraveling and the seam will come undone. So what I like to do is I like to take this and I like to pull it over to the back side like this, and then right where you can see this, let me see if I can focus better. Right here on these threads, I want to do a little tack stitch. So I'm going to just tack this down. Now, on home machines, you do have a hard time getting the machine to actually sew that, so just be aware. The reason for that is because under here, if you can see it, go ahead and look at your machine, I'll take this foot off, is that the feed dogs here are so wide set apart from each other that these little pieces, right, end up going in between these little feed dogs, and there's not much there for the feed dog to grab a hold of, or the feed dogs are not close enough to each other to actually pull anything through. So you may have to fight with it a little bit, but if you can just get it tacked down in that area, it will help it from unraveling. So this is kind of a two-step process. So this is the first step. I'm going to pull this over, and I'm actually doing this on the back. So this is the back of the tank top, because we're going to actually do one more step after this. So I pulled it to the back side, and now I'm going to try to get this in here. Right? Okay. And then right where that thread is, I just want to just tack the thread down. So really easy. I know my hand is in a weird spot because my reverse button is right above here. It's right up here, and if I use my right hand, which I'm right-handed, it will cover the camera. So I'm still on a zigzag stitch. Let me get out of here. Okay, so just a couple stitches. It's not gonna do that. Let me see if I can get it in there a little bit more. See, I'm struggling. And back stitch. Okay, that did it. That's all I needed to do. You see how that's held in there now? Now I can actually clip those threads. Clip these threads. Okay, and now it's like rolled over that seam so it won't come undone, and it's held there. So the next step I'm gonna do is you see how it stands up away from the body? I actually want to fold that over to the back side, and now I'm going to tack this down. Let me see. Now I'm going to tack the seam allowance down to where the binding is. So the way I'm going to do it, you could do it this way if you want, if you're looking at that, but I like to do it from the top, because then I can know that my stitching is going to be a little bit nicer. The other thing that I'm going to do is, instead of putting it in this way where all the bulk is, and the machine certainly won't like that, and it won't have anything back here to hold on to if I drop the foot again, you'll see that most of the feed dogs are behind the foot. So this is where most of the motion is going to be coming from. So what I'm going to do to try to use those feed dogs is, let me get this back in here, is I'm going to turn it around like this. So I'm going to sew into the binding. So I'm going to just kind of start just under the binding, and hoping that those feed dogs in the back, I'll probably help it out a little bit, will actually pull the fabric for me. So again, my seam allowance is actually being folded toward the back, and I'm going to be top stitching really just kind of where the binding is. I'm going to drop my needle first, and then the presser foot, and then I'm going to try to sew. And I know I'm getting really close to the needle here with my finger right here, but I really want it to go under the foot. And you can kind of tug from it behind just to get it going. Once you get it through there, then you can hit your reverse, and it should reverse okay a stitch or two. So I'm going to have to get my arm out of the camera way, okay? So I'm pulling it from the back. Going slow, reverse. It will usually reverse easier than it will go forward. So I'll take this out now. And now we can see that this is actually holding on there, and now it won't bug you at your underarm. All right, and I'm just going to, I dropped my snip, so I just need to trim up these threads. So I will see you one more time over at the table to have a final look at the tank top. All right, so this is our tank top. Again, we've tacked all of our side seams, and one thing that I didn't show you on camera was that I actually did the same thing on the other shoulder seam. I also pulled the serger thread back around the back, and then I folded it toward the back and top stitched it down. So you might want to do that on your shoulder seam as well. So let's turn this inside out. Okay, and this is the back of your racer back tank top, and here is the front. All right, so now if you want to press this, you can. I would say be very careful. I would use a press cloth over the areas that you want to press. If you want to press the binding areas or the hem, use a press cloth like a cotton, muslin, something lightweight that is going to absorb the steam. Don't keep the iron on it too long, because it will be hot and you don't want to melt any of the synthetic fibers if you have a knit with polyester, nylon, something like that. So also, I did just want to mention anywhere that I use a zigzag stitch, like the hem and on the binding, you can of course use your cover stitch machine if you have a cover stitch machine to do that. Also, if your cover stitch machine has an option or an attachment to put the binding on itself, follow the directions for the width of the binding that you need. Use the pattern pieces for the length of the amount of the binding you need, but follow your machine's or your attachment's width guide for attaching the binding. It will go on just similar to this, except that you will have a folder that you will insert fabric into, and then it will sew it right, it will fold it and sew it right onto the edge of the garment as well. So this pattern is built to do that, so you won't really lose much of the width here at all. So that's the way that I built this pattern, so that if you have a binding attachment, you can definitely use that to add the binding.